In German, we have a lot of words which are accentuated on the first syllabus, as for instance Friede, Liebe, Spielen, but also verbs, reden, laufen, adjectives, glücklich, friedvoll, einsam, etc. So it's not surprising that especially in the Viennese classic we often find an articulation which derives obviously from the language. For instance, let's have a look on the beginning of Beethoven's Sonata Opus 110. We can see that the first two notes are bound together with a bow from C to A flat. When we listen to recordings, unfortunately, we rarely will hear this motif played that way. Many pianists are playing the A flat as an upbeat. Here you can listen to two versions. The second one is played by Paul Badura-Skoda, the first one by another famous pianist. Even in the volume curves it can be seen that Badura-Skoda plays the second chord much softer than it is played in the first recording. It may sometimes help to invent a text as, for instance, Liebste, lass uns fortgehen. This would not be possible in French. The same phrase in French sounds Chérie, laisse-nous quitter. We realize that it is a complete different kind of prosody, which does not fit at all with the written music. Let's stay at Beethoven. We have a wonderful example where Beethoven himself has added a word, the beginning of the Sonata Opus 81a, Les Adieux. The word lebe wohl, what means farewell, shows us exactly how these three first notes should be played. This junction of text and music, of course, is not an invention of the Viennese classic. It derives from the music of the Renaissance and the Baroque. Bach used this also in many instrumental works. Here an example. In the E major fugue of the second part of the Well-Tempered Piano, he uses two choral melodies for the main theme and for the counter subject. The main theme comes from the Gregorian choral Pangelingua, which exists in many different variations throughout the centuries. Here you can see the version of Thomas von Aquin, composed in the 13th century. The second theme is from a choral which is mentioned for the first time in 1675. This theme and variations of it Bach has used about 15 times in his compository creations. When we speak this text, we know immediately how we have to articulate. Was Gott tut, das ist wohl getan. In Bach's fugue, it looks like this. Now to some other examples in which the knowledge of the connection between word and music is of elementary importance, as at the beginning of the sonata in F major K332 by Mozart. Mozart wrote very detailed bows. Why? Certainly not that we shall ignore them. Again, we can help us for understanding by inventing a text. For instance, welche Freude dieses Wiedersehen. And in the second themes group we can, for instance, invent was für ein schönes Bild. For the beginning of the third movement of Haydn's sonata in B minor, my teacher Richard Hauser told me, think of, was wird denn da der Hauser sagen? What will Hauser say? Even for Brahms, this connection of words and music was very important. Beginning from his first piano sonata on to his late pieces, as for instance the Intermezzi, we always will find hints to a rhetorical speech. Let's have a look to the second movement of this first sonata in C major opus 1. As in all three sonatas, he uses an old tune in the slow movement. But in this sonata, he even wrote the original text beneath. Also, that the original tune is a little bit different. So we can see that even in instrumental pieces, the musical speech is very close to the spoken language. And therefore, the right articulation is very important for the composers of the Viennese classics and as well for many of their successors. Here are some more examples concerning articulation. The Adagio theme of Mozart's Fantasy in D minor K397 looks like this. We don't see any bows at the beginning, just at the end of the second bar. Nevertheless, most of pianists are playing a legato. But we have to know that this piece has been written for a funeral service, and these falling eighths symbolize mourning, the sadness which lies on one's shoulders and make every step arduous. Therefore, these notes should be played separately. Again, you can listen to two famous pianists. The first one is a Mozart specialist, Maria João Pires. The second, playing everything legato, is played by another very famous artist. A similar misunderstanding we can find in Mozart Sonata in C major K545. Most of pianists are playing the themes legato, but we have a very detailed setting of bows which shows us that these first notes should not be bound together. As difficult as it is to find the right articulation, one could think that it should be much easier to find the right phrasing. But strangely enough, concerning the musical phrasing, there can also be heard many mistakes which unfortunately still are very common today. In the second movement of Beethoven's Sonata in C minor, Opus 13, the well-known Pathétique, we rarely can hear what the composer has written. And this is really a pity, because he has marked these signs every time when this main tune appears. So it must have been very important for him. And not. There is another aspect which has something to do with spoken language, and this is the musical dialogue. We can see this very clearly in Beethoven's 17th Sonata in D minor, Opus 31, number 2, The Tempest, where it is said that Beethoven himself has told his pupil Schindler to read Shakespeare's drama, The Tempest, for better understanding this sonata. If we listen to the part beginning at bar 21 of the first movement, we can hear this kind of dialogue, which is not just a dialogue but a musical expression of quarrel. Two persons, the first giving a statement in forte, the second answering in piano. The discussion becomes more and more fiery. The second person is contradicting immediately. Finally, the dialogue escalates. Contradiction takes place in one bar, both shouting to each other in fortissimo. This is a good example how analysis can lead to an interpretation. The second movement of the same sonata starts also with a dialogue, but this time peaceful and quiet, melting together towards the end of the phrase. Let's have a look now on other means of expression, where analyzing helps us for better understanding. I am thinking, for instance, of the second movement of Haydn's Sonata in E minor. We can realize that Haydn uses Baroque ornamentation based on the art of improvisation. And it is necessary to find out which notes are relevant for the construction. Only too often these parts are played like an etude by Czerny. But there is a wonderful immanent melodical line which we should bring out. The results can be various. One of these could sound like this. Also fascinating are unexpected buildings of phrases. Joseph Haydn loved to joke and to surprise us. Here is an example from a very early sonata where he first writes, as in classical music unusual, a 3 bars phrase. Then 2 bars, he repeats once more 2 bars, and when we think that it will go on now this way, he surprises us again with another phrase of 3 bars. He could have done it 4 times in 2 bars, but this would not be our brilliant genius Haydn. Another example shows us that if we are aware of what happens in a phrase, we are able to better understand the intentions of a composer. In the so-called Little Sonata in A major D664 by Franz Schubert, the second movement starts with a very unusual language. The first thing which is bothering is that this phrase has only 7 bars instead of expected 8 ones. But even more exciting is the kind of expression. While the first 6 bars are repeating all with the same rhythm and motives, somehow creating the atmosphere of a lullaby, suddenly the 7th bar interrupts this atmosphere with a frightening changement of the rhythm. The calm line of the beginning breaks into pieces and shows us, as so often in pieces of Schubert, that the beginning pretends a quietness which exists only at the surface. This 7th bar is an inner level full of despair and sadness. The sudden stop at the end of this phrase counteracts the beginning and causes that we have to continue with the second phrase in a completely uncertain, doubtful way. Let's stay at Schubert and take a look to the second movement of his C minor sonata D958. The fact that the two similar parts are notated with completely different dynamics led people for a long time think that these notations must be accidentally, that Schubert did not take care and therefore he has made so many mistakes. Many musicians synchronize these two parts, not understanding that Schubert, who besides was a meticulous composer, as we know last but not least because of his correspondence with editors, wanted to express a shaking changement of emotions. In the first part we can hear ferocity, somehow aggression, a feeling full of despair. The second version is poor resignation and weakness. Especially in cases like these, we need to have excellent additions because some editors flattened these dynamic marks because they did not understand what Schubert wanted to express. Now I want to show you how motives develop in a piece. One of the great masters is Beethoven, who often fixed in the first bars of a sonata the main motifs, which are building the basic motivical elements not only of the first movement but of the whole sonata. Therefore, we will analyze the sonata in C minor, Opus 13, once more, named by the composer himself Grande Sonate Pathétique. In the first bar, we can find three very important elements. The chord, including not only thirds, but also a chord, which becomes one of the main intervals throughout the whole sonata, marked blue. The diatonic line of three notes C, D, E flat, marked red, and the suspension E flat, D, a semitone interval, marked green. Already in the left hand we see that he uses the same motifs, but in inversion. We will see that Beethoven has used these three patterns in different successions and in many variations, but they all can be put back to the first bar of the sonata. One may ask, what does this knowledge help for? It helps us to understand that this opus is not to be seen divided into three movements, but that we can detect a piece which is composed as a unit, that our interpretation has to go through all three movements. The first movement causes the second, and the second the third movement. The chord with thirds and the chord. The chord becomes very important during the whole sonata. Then there is the diatonic line. Already in the left hand we can hear the inversion. And the third element is the suspension, or the second. Again, in the left hand, the inversion. So we have all three elements here in one bar. Already at the beginning of the main part of the sonata, we can hear the first theme. And here we have first the chord, then the diatonic line, and the suspension. There is only one note in the middle with between the chord. Immediately afterwards, we can hear again inversion. We have the chord, now down, and the diatonic line, and as well the suspension. And later, the second theme of the first movement sounds like this. So again we have chord and diatonic line. At the beginning of the second movement, Beethoven has changed the successions of the motives. Now we have, this is the second, now is the chord and the diatonic line. Immediately afterwards, we see another variation of the following of the three motives. We have the second, the chord, and the inversion of the chord, the fifth. And in the left hand we have the diatonic line and the suspension. In the first episode we find another variation. We have diatonic line, now fifth upwards, afterwards chord down, and the suspension. Also in the second episode we can find these elements. We have the chord at the beginning and the diatonic line. And afterwards we have the suspension. Again, the three notes and suspension. And at the beginning of the third movement, we realize immediately that this first theme is very similar to the second theme of the first movement. The new idea is that this diatonic line doesn't go only upwards but also downwards. And this becomes important a little bit later because there he uses upwards and down. There's a wonderful part in the middle of this movement. Again, we have the chords, and these chords are built on the top of a diatonic line. And in the left hand we have the inversion. Suspension. Now changing the voices. Suspension. And at the end of this movement, in the coda, we once more can hear this up and down motif. That this way of analyzing does not work only with pieces of the Viennese classic, this may be proved by two other examples. The first one is the Fantasy Impromptu Opus 66 by Chopin, a piece which is rather famous for its technical requirements, but which also gives us an impression of the high value of compository skills of Chopin. The first 8 notes in the right hand are building an ornament surrounding G sharp and a broken chord, G sharp, C sharp, E. The ornament and the chord together later in this piece, we can find this ornamental passage augmented as a melodic line, first in the right hand, at the end of part 1 in both hands. Also the motif of the broken chord appears at the same places. And we have the ornament and the chord. And at the end of the part A, we can hear chord and the ornament. Exactly the same notes as at the beginning, only in augmentation. And in the coda, he uses once more augmentation as a recapitulation of the second theme. And with the last example, we can realize that even Schoenberg used the same way of transformations of motifs, as we can see amongst others in the first of the 6 little pieces, Opus 19. More or less, the whole piece is based on the motif of the first 4 notes in the left hand. These 4 notes are the substance of this first piece of Opus 19. The intervals are a third, a fifth, and a semitone. Of course, we have also a sept, these 2 sept. Just the syntactical means are different, as the timeline is changing. For instance, 2 different parts of the motifs can happen at the same time, also in form of a chord, as in bar 1, left hand. Or they can be splitted off into 2 voices, bar 3, left hand. The positions can change between a wide range, as the element of a second can go from F3 to F sharp 2. Inversions can happen as in bar 16, compared with bar 10. E2, C sharp 2, F2 is much closer to D2, A1, C sharp 1 than it seems at the first moment. But if we take the inversion F2, C sharp 2, E2 and transpose it a third down and change the position of the octaves, we come exactly to D2, A1, C sharp 1. In this time we have to know that it is of no importance if we have a big third or a small one. Accidentials also don't change the motivic structures. The second interval can also surround the third interval, as we can see, for instance, in bar 5 left hand, etc. Here you can listen now to this piece, and you will see marked in green all places which can be reduced in their motivical structure to the first 4 notes of the left hand. I hope that I have been able to explain with this very small extract what in our musical education is of great importance and what makes perhaps the difference to other schools, which, at my opinion, is to be found in the way of our access to a composition. Of course, the emotional expression has to stand above all, and this can be wide-ranged emotions with all ups and downs, as we know from real life. But this analysis helps us for better understanding of the composer's intentions, and helps us as well to argue why we have come to a special kind of interpretation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to see you again. Goodbye.